my friends! It is finally time for me to give you my recap of my 4-month-long trip in Asia. I finally edited and uploaded all of my Asia vlogs. I have all the videos organized by country that I visited, so make sure you check out the playlists here. And since I'm done with editing all of that content, I figured it was time to finally give you the much deserved recap of my trip and also answer some questions from you all. So if you're new here, hi, I'm Amy. I just took a 4-month-long trip traveling Taiwan, Japan, and Korea. I focus mostly on solo and slow traveling on a budget, and I share my experiences via highlights and travel vlogs on Instagram and YouTube, which you can check out here. Alright, so basic recap of my trip. So I had planned for my trip to Taiwan in like February, March of 2023. But come December of 2022, I found out from my landlord that I wouldn't have a place to stay anymore past spring of 2023, which you can see in my vlog here. So I ended my lease right before my Taiwan trip, and it was kind of like the start of my nomad journey. I was technically free to go wherever I wanted for however long I wanted, so my Taiwan plans kind of shifted a little bit in that I bought a one-way ticket to Taiwan, and it was just kind of like, you know what, I'm gonna see how this goes. I'm going to see where my adventures take me. I opted to go the one-way ticket route, but then quickly realized that I kind of needed tickets going elsewhere after the fact. Because I was a US passport holder, I could go to Taiwan without a visa as long as I stayed under 90 days. So I needed to also provide proof that I was leaving the country before that time limit. I ended up buying a ticket to Japan kind of like right before I went to Taiwan, so I had that handy, and that's kind of how I approached like all of the countries that I visited on this trip. I was just like plan my next country as I was gearing up to leave for the country. I tried my best to take a stab at slow traveling during this trip, especially in Taiwan, because I had a full 2 months there, but I just honestly feel like there's never enough time. I think every country that I visited kind of had a very different feeling because my mindset going into it was a little bit different. For Taiwan, I wanted to explore. I wanted to see all the things. It was not my first time there, but it was my first time traveling by myself as an adult. And then everything that I was experiencing and eating, it just kind of reminded me of the stories that my parents would tell me when we were younger of how they grew up in Taiwan. So I thought that was a very special and kind of meaningful trip in that way. It brought me a little bit closer to my heritage. And then for Japan, I had never visited before in my life. I had a slight layover at the beginning of my trip, and then I took 2 weeks there. But I honestly focused on like very basic tourist things. I wanted to get that full tourist experience out of the way, but I also didn't anticipate having to deal with travel fatigue for like a whole week while I was there, so that was also kind of difficult. And then going to Korea again was just kind of like the cherry on top, because honestly, I didn't have big plans of going, but then I was like, you know what? I'm already here on this side of the world. I might as well hop on over because, as you know, I love Korea. And I've already done a fair share of exploring in my last trip, so I just kind of wanted to, you know, take time to relax, redo the things that I like, meet my friends. So it was a more relaxing trip, and it also worked out in that way because I did end up getting COVID while I was there, so had a whole week of just self-quarantine and not being able to do anything. But in a way, this trip was kind of a way for me to test the waters in how to be a digital nomad like full-time, or to just travel full-time. And what I learned is traveling full-time is really, really hard. I definitely had my ups and downs. If I were to do this long-term, I would really need to learn how to slow down more, because like I mentioned, I dealt with travel fatigue maybe 2 months into my travels, and it was just really rough. It was really hard to bounce back while still on the road. But I definitely learned a lot about how I like to travel. Like I mentioned a little bit in my last days in Asia's vlog, I learned more about how I like to travel and how I valued experiences way more than sightseeing, and kind of need to learn how to adjust my expectations and not be so FOMO-y with tourist spots that I clearly have no interest in. So that's kind of the gist of my trip. I've mentioned most of the stuff in parts throughout my travel vlogs, but you know, for those of you who may not have watched all of them, that was kind of a big recap of my 4 months abroad. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about for this trip. I threw out this question to you guys a few weeks back about what you wanted to learn about my trip and my experiences. So let's get to it. The first question I got was, did you apply for a special pass that allows you to stay longer in Taiwan? I mentioned this earlier in my recap, but no, I did not apply for any special visas or passes. I entered the country with a US passport, so I had visa-free entry for under 90 days. What has been top 2 favorite foods of the countries that you have visited so far? This is hard because for Taiwan, honestly, my favorite part about Taiwan was the food. Of course, I love all the fruits, but fruits aside, I think my 2 favorite dishes, first one is the cherry tomato and preserved plum combo. Such a unique kind of snack that's only available in Taiwan. And then the second one I would have to say is egg pancake for breakfast or just any time of the day, because I love that shit. It's so simple, but they do it so well. For Japan, I think, I don't know what my favorite dishes in Japan was. Some things that really stand out is I've never had a croquette before going to Japan, and minced beef croquette I got at Asakusa. It turned me. I was after that, I was on a hunt for croquettes, whether it be at Family Marts or whatever. I was that, I want that. But it never quite lived up to the initial one that I got, so I think that one was one of my favorites. And the second one is the tamago at the Tsukiji market. It was just so different from tamago that you would usually get at sushi restaurants, especially in the US. It was so fresh and fluffy and sweet. Oh, it was so good. I still dream about those dishes today. And then for Korea, my favorite foods, I've probably talked about this before, but my number 1 is going to be hotdog. It is the best treat, especially during winter time. And then also kanjang is one of my favorites as well. Soy sauce marinated crab, and I'm so happy that I finally get to have that again during this trip. During your travels, were there any specific activities or places, whether experiences, day trips, accommodations, monuments, beauty treatments, cafes, or restaurants, whew, that's a lot, that didn't quite live up to the hype and you wouldn't necessarily recommend to others? This is hard. I can't think of anything in particular, but I will have to say by the end of my trip, especially when I got to Japan, I was so tired of looking at temples. I was just over it. I think one of the biggest things I realized through my travels is I really don't like sightseeing for the sake of sightseeing. And that's also something that I wouldn't really recommend unless you are really interested in the history of things, in which case I would recommend taking a walking tour instead, because then you actually get that background information and learn the significance of the place that you're visiting. Whereas when you just go, you take all this time to travel there, and then you spend 5 minutes looking at the place and then you leave. It's just kind of very anticlimactic, I would say. Hi Amy, I watched your solo travel vlog in Korea, FAQ, and it got me thinking, where did you end up getting rid of those 2 broken suitcases? I know Korea is pretty particular about recycling and such, so I'm guessing you couldn't just toss them in any old dumpster. Yes, that is correct. Trash in Asia is very different than in the US. You rarely see any big dumpsters around, and then a trash collection is also a whole different method. In Korea, I actually didn't have to deal too much with, dumping the trash because I mostly stayed at hostels and stuff. So I just had to make sure that when I put away my trash, they were in the correct collection bin. They kind of handled trash days and all of that. For my suitcases, I struggled with figuring out how to deal with them. Luckily, I was staying at a guest house at that time, so I just left it with the guest house owner and then asked them to take care of it for me. And they were really nice, they were really accommodating, and was able to help me out with that. So that's kind of how I dealt with it. Overall, how would you compare your travel experiences in the countries you visited in terms of convenience and safety? So first, I like to say all the countries that I visited, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, they're all very relatively safe. I did not feel threatened or anything going around place to place as a solo female traveler. The only place I would say I had concerns about was in Japan. In all the countries I don't make it a point to walk around at night, but it has happened. And Japan was the only place when that had happened that I didn't quite feel as comfortable. I had gone with a group of friends to Shinsekai at like 10 p.m. at night, trying to get like a late night snack. And there were a bunch of like drunk men outside on the streets, and one of them kept on approaching us and trying to talk to us because we had foreigners in the group, and they just wouldn't leave us alone even though we had guys in the group and stuff. And the craziest thing about that was there was a police officer literally like right across the alleyway. He saw everything go down and he didn't do anything. Like that moment was kind of like really uncomfortable because we just wanted to get away. Luckily, we were able to remove ourselves from that situation, but like this all happened in a very like brightly lit street. There was a police officer right there, and like this was still happening. So I think that instance kind of made me realize like, oh, it might not be that safe here. But again, you gotta use your common sense. Don't go out late at night by yourself. You're not creating a safe environment for yourself in that situation. Convenience wise, I think all three countries have really robust public transportation systems, so it was really easy for me to get around. I definitely personally found Korea and Taiwan a little bit more convenient to get around, but mostly because of my lack of understanding in the Japanese language, and so comfort levels weren't really quite there. So getting around kind of took a little bit finagling and a lot of Google Translate happening there. I recently went on a 2-week trip to Japan, and I was so exhausted from traveling, exploring every single day, but you want to make the most of your trip. So I was wondering if you experienced something similar and how did you deal with it? Definitely. It was so hard, and I talked a little bit about this in my recap and also in other videos, especially in my Mount Fuji vlog, but I was dealing with major travel fatigue 2 months into my trip. I was also dealing with like creator burnout. I just like didn't want to film myself. I didn't want to do anything. It was really rough on me, like physically and mentally at that point. It's like what you said, right? Like you want to make the most of everything, but you kind of have to realize that like you can't make the most of it if you're not mentally prepared or ready for it. So I ended up taking a lot of time to rest in between, and that's kind of how I dealt with it. I was just like, hey, if I'm not feeling up to it, I'm just not going to go for it. I will take this time to relax and just be. I had to come to terms that I didn't need to do everything that was on these like travel guides or like must-do lists, because a lot of the times those things aren't things that I'm necessarily interested in. So if I force myself into something I'm not interested in, it's only going to weigh me down even more mentally. Like I would feel even more tired, as opposed to if I just allowed myself time to rest and then pursue activities and experiences that I was actually genuinely interested in. It would like motivate me more to do more stuff in turn. So yeah. Budgeting. Teach us how to budget with real numbers. All right, so this is hard for me to go over because I honestly don't think I'm the best budgeter. I say that I do budget travel, but honestly, I don't even know if I do budget traveling because there are a lot of times where I will splurge on experiences. But this ultimately leads to like what my outlook is on finance stuff is that I think things are only worth what they are worth if you think they're worth that much. Does that make sense? I just say worth a lot. It's hard to define what a good deal is. And so I think it's more subjective in that like if you think it's a good deal in according to your finances and your means, then that's great. Then you should go for it. And that kind of influences how I spend on these travels and stuff. So there are times when I did spend a lot more than I probably should have, but because it was an experience I really wanted, I felt like it was worth the money. So in case you were wondering, I spent close to $10,000 for my 4 months abroad in Asia. That's including flights and also room and board, all of that. I do think that I saved a lot of money while I was in Taiwan because I did not spend nearly as much on room and board because I did some work exchanges while I was there, and then I also spent 2 weeks in China where I didn't spend any money at all because I was with family and just stayed at home the entire time. So the way that I manage my budget and my expenses is through Google Sheets. I'm sure there are a lot of templates out there that do similar things. This is something that I made for my 2-month trip to Korea, and I kind of adapted that to my 4th month trip here. So as you can see, I start out with a budget page. So I have like daily expenses, weekly expenses, monthly expenses. Monthly expenses would be like if I need to pay rent back home, mobile plans, anything that like subscriptions that I usually have ongoing. Daily expenses would be like how much do I want to spend on food for lunch, dinner? Do I want to go to a cafe every single day? How much would I want to allot myself? Also transportation. I know that I usually do public transportation while in Asia. I'll need money for that every day to get to places. And then weekly expenses, I might not do a tour every single day, but I'll probably do one once a week, or like having experiences like going to the personal color analysis, ring making, all of that is not, it might not be daily activities, but chances are I'll probably do 1 or 2 a week. So I kind of have my budget laid out this way, and of course like to each their own what they feel is worth in spending, where they want to put their money focus on. That's all very personal, but this is just the way that I have laid it out for myself. And then having that budget set monthly, I can see like if I have a certain amount of savings, how long would I be able to last on this budget? Or on the flip side, with this kind of budget, how much money do I need to save up if I want to take an X amount of time trip? So that's kind of how my budgeting worked, but then it doesn't really work until you put it into action, right? So that's when the expense tracking came in, and this is kind of where I'm like not the best at budgeting because I would find myself spending a lot one day, and then the way I would rectify it is not spending too much the second day. So like if one day I decide I'm going to go cafe hopping, then clearly I'm going to go over my like cafe budget. But then how I will rectify that spending is be like, okay, the next day I'll just only eat convenience store foods for lunch and dinner. Like that will just offset the cost there. So that's kind of how I went about my travels day to day. It took a lot of tedious tracking, but it was also easier because I was doing it day by day. You can see that like through the trip, I kind of was able to offset my spendings, not even from a day-to-day standpoint, but also category to category across countries. Like how I mentioned earlier, I spent less on accommodations in Taiwan, but then I realized when I got to Japan, like accommodations were a lot more expensive. So I ended up spending a lot more in Japan in those 2 weeks than I did relatively in that same amount of time in Taiwan. But because I was able to save on my like accommodations budget in Taiwan, it kind of like balanced out when I went over in Japan. As you can see from my numbers here, Japan was definitely the most expensive country that I visited. One thing I learned was that you definitely have to book in advance for Japan, and that's not just for activities, it's also for accommodations. Like cheap accommodations will go so fast. The moment that you know you're going, you should look into accommodations, and then like if you see something that you like that's for a good price, just go for it, because it'll probably be gone by the time that you like him and ha over it a little bit. So I hope that helps give you a little bit more insight into the trip that I had. But as always, feel free to ask any questions that you may have in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching and following along my adventures, and stay tuned for more travel content coming soon. I'll see you guys next time. Bye! Filming while sick is probably not the best idea for my throat, but it is what it is. Gotta get the content.